I was shot at 5 times, and I was twice by Loyalists, so-called, and 3 times by Republicans, but it wouldn't have mattered to my mother which one hit me. I'll give you an example again. When the Yorkshire Ripper in England was on the go, there were 50 detectives assigned to try and track down a £5 note. 50. And there was 10 in the murder squad, dealing literally with hundreds and hundreds of murders in one office. I mean, I can remember being in the murder squad office, and there was no wall. It was just covered in file boxes. You just literally, because that's what it was like, you didn't know, in the next 5 minutes whether you'd be laughing, crying, injured, dead. And that's what I was trying to convey. So
thanks very much for sitting down with me. I appreciate you taking the time. Can you do us a bit of a favor? Can you give us like an intro on yourself? You were 14 plus years in the RUC. So you might tell us a bit about those years and maybe even what the RUC is for people who mightn't be familiar.
I will indeed. I joined the police, I suppose, quite by accident, but I intended to study law at Trinity in Dublin, and I went over to work in America, funnily enough, for the summer, and but then was been traveling about, and I met friends, and then decided to go the following year, and it was a bit early on the old gap year front, but anyway, next year never really happened, and I had in my hometown been in the part-time reserve, to be truthful, more as a way of a bit of money, and you could work what hours you wished, rather than any great financial reward. But anyway, that had sort of steered me towards it. And funny enough, my brother, who had gone to Trinity, he emigrated to Canada and joined the police there. So anyway, I ended up joining and ended up stationed in Belfast, and the troubles were ongoing, and of course the law never happened.
I'm sorry, what year did you join up? How
that year, that would have been 1981, whenever I joined the regulars. Had sort of a little bit of been away and back and forth to America prior to that, so I would have joined. That was the year of the hunger strike, and a fairly shall we politely call it busy time for the RUC. And as you mentioned, the stands for the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which were the police force that took over in Northern Ireland after partition, when the Royal Irish Constabulary faded following partition. And they carried on until their name was changed in 2001, morphed into the Police Service of Northern Ireland.
Okay, so you joined. You said 83. So the troubles had been raging like a good decade. I think 72 and 74 were the two bloodiest years. So
yeah, they would have been.
Yeah, you came along following a very.
I had joined the part time, as I was saying to you, in Bangor, but that was in 1977. And that it was only really, obviously, when I got into the full time, that was, I became full time in 1980. And I worked in North Belfast, which always was and probably still is one of the busiest police stations in Northern Ireland, and at one point would have had probably one of the highest crime rates in Europe during the Troubles. And a lot of those murders you referred to from the 70s would have taken place in that area, the division I was in, around Tennant Street and Old Park. And yet it was quite a small area, but I think statistically it's madness in terms of the number of overall murders, even given what was going on in Northern Ireland. In fact, my first week in Tennant Street, I was first in the scene at 3 murders, and it could have been 5. Only 2 of the people survived. And I'd come from, Bangor, sort of quiet town down the coast, and I just couldn't work out, where have I ended up? It was just day and night compared to the way I grew up.
You touched on it there actually kind of briefly, and I wanted to ask you to provide the listeners with a bit of context. But the troubles were like hyper concentrated. Like Ireland itself is a small country, but it didn't even take place. You can't even say it took place in Ireland. It took place very specifically in the north, and even more specifically again in more concentrated areas. Can you give people a bit of a?
I can indeed. I mean, if you even compared it to one of the states in America, and tried to divide it up into the area, the percentage of areas directly affected. I mean, I live 20 minutes away, I still do, from where I'm talking about in North Belfast. But in terms of the towns or city, well, Belfast City and Bangor Town, I mean, it is just day and night. And actually, Dennis Street Station, which was one relatively small station in a very small division, I remember the busiest month it ever had was 29 murders in 31 days. And you barely had time to go to the murder scene and get the person's name and address before you left to go to the next one. And it sometimes causes a bit of, I don't mean ill feeling, but concerning when people come to you 50 years later and say, well, why didn't you do this and why didn't you do that? And you quite literally hardly had time to get the person identified before you went to the next one. And don't forget, it's not like nowadays where there's a whole system. You have computers. I mean, the murder squad in Tennant Street dealt with many murder gangs from both sides of the community. And the problem they had that they were dealing with was that, quite simply, people were scared to speak to them or help them. It's not like normal policing where people would be witnesses, tell you what happened, who they'd seen, didn't see, or whatever it might have been. That just didn't occur. And there were 10 in the murder squad, not a computer between them. And at one stage, I remember the 319 open murder cases on their desk. It was just an impossible task. In fact, one, they're verging a bit, but one detective sergeant, I know, he went over to a CID course in England, which was just a normal course thing for a few weeks. And the instructor asked if there was anybody here ever been involved in a murder. And of course, in England, a few people put their hand up, and they'd been very much on the periphery, very minorly involved. Whereas in Belfast, you'd have had constables dealing with murders because there simply wasn't the manpower to do anything else. And I remember Sam's Christian name was, he put his hand up then and he said, no, you've been involved in a murder inquiry as well. And there's only a couple of hands went up to say there'd been maybe one. And they said, how many murders have you been involved with? And he said, I'm currently investigating 64. And you know, people just couldn't take that in. I mean, currently investigating 64. And I mean, it was an impossible job.
That's insane altogether. Yeah, they were God, they were very unique times. Fortunately, it's something that's very much in the past. But yeah, very violent times. Most of these deaths, if you could put like a rough kind of percentage, were the majority shootings? There weren't that many bombings, thankfully. But
there were some explosions, not so many mass murder bombings. It would mostly have been shootings, and quite a lot of them individually shot on just sectarian murders on either side, and you know, answering your front door quite literally in certain areas, and then being shot by somebody from the other side for whatever reason. And very often, I mean, there was no reason other than where you lived and you were a different religion. It was as stupid as that. Not that it could ever get bright, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, actually, on the topic of religion, one of the criticisms that the RUC has or had back when it existed was there was very much a skewed Protestant and Catholic ratio within it. When you joined, kind of mid-80s, how many, like out of 10, if there's 10 officers, how many are Catholic, how many Protestant, roughly?
I don't actually. The percentage was traditionally very low, and it was unquestionably the religious breakdown would have been predominantly Protestant. The irony is that actually in the police, I never heard people discuss that because you were all wearing the same uniform and you were all, no matter what the background of the person, you were just placed. They used to say there was 3 religions in Northern Ireland. There was Catholics, Protestants, and policemen, because the policemen really didn't care. If you're going to running towards danger, you don't really care who's with you. You just know and want to know, and they need to know that the person who's running beside you has your back. And religion never, ever was a feature between them. And when the call came in to a shooting, a bombing, whatever it might have been, or just ordinary crime, I mean, you were never going, I wonder what religion those people are. I mean, it was everybody outside of the place seemed to be very concerned. But, you know, I was shot at 5 times, and I was twice by Loyalists, so-called, and 3 times by Republicans, but it wouldn't have mattered to my mother which one hit me. It just didn't come into it. In the force, people outside it tended to obsess more about it. And the other irony, indeed, when in my books, there's a story about some of the guys. And I remember that very distinctly. He was from West Belfast, but very often someone in West Belfast who was obviously from a Catholic background had joined the police, but really they couldn't go back to West Belfast ever to visit their parents or see their families. And part of the reason for the imbalance, which doesn't tend to get reported, but it would tend to be because if they did join, that was the end of them, and they were actually more of a target to Republican terrorists because they were sort of seen as traitors or something. And there was one guy who's described in the book. He went home for the weekend to see his parents, and one of the guys he worked with said to him, "Are you sure you're wise? Could you not arrange to meet them somewhere rather than going back home?" And he said, "I can look." And his very expression was to him, "I know they're bad, but they're not that bad." And he was on Sunday morning checking, as he used to in cars, the oil and water before he drove back up to Derry. And when he was leaning over the bonnet, they came and shot him dead outside his parents' house. Another guy I know who lived down, or was from down around the border area, I was with him. I was actually in a bar, and he was drinking orange juice. So of course, I said, "What's wrong with you? You're not having a drink?" And he said, "No, I'm actually going down to visit my mum." And I said, "Well, anyway," it transpired he was going down to see his mother, which was at the border and about an hour's drive from where we were. And she didn't know he was coming. He said he would arrive about 4:15 in the morning, and he couldn't stay in the house any longer than 15 minutes, so they'd know he was there. He would just quickly say hello, wake him up in the middle of the night, and drive off. And that was just the way they lived. But when they joined, that was part and parcel of the decision they made. So really the reason, I'm not saying it was the entire reason, but it was a big factor, was quite simply that it was too dangerous for people from a nationalist area who would have been particularly hunted by the IRA for assassination if they did join, because it was some sort of traitor thing in their head.
I see. Did that sentiment exist on the other side? If you came from a Protestant background, I assume if you went back home to like the old neighborhood, you wouldn't be viewed like unfavorably, or would you?
No, it wouldn't have been the same. It would have tended to have been a more Republican viewpoint, as in people from a more unionist background didn't mind if people had joined with anything. So there was never that particular fear, but it was just the nationalist areas, and of course in the areas that may have been where the Republican terrorists may have obviously operated more freely and knew people and would have realized that you were back. So it certainly that would have been a one way, or people couldn't go to their own parents' funerals and things like that. I mean, they just had to stay away forever. In fact, again, in one of the books, there's a policewoman whose mother had died, and her brother was in the IRA, and he told her that not to be coming to the funeral. I'll shoot you, not just the Republican movement will. And she couldn't go back. And actually, her boss made an arrangement with the local parish priest to go down to visit her mother in the chapel where she was lying in rest overnight. And he got her half an hour, sort of say her goodbyes, but she couldn't go to the funeral or ever speak to the family again. To this day, she now lives in Scotland, actually.
I assume within the RUC, probably the majority, not even because they were Protestant, but I assume the majority were in favor of the 6 counties staying as part of Britain, as opposed to joining the Republic, or was that even, would it even have been discussed?
It wouldn't have been a topic for discussion, but probably because the majority of them came from a unionist background. But I never heard anybody who came from a nationalist background who had joined talked about wanting to be in a united Ireland. There's sometimes, I think it's a bit of a myth. I mean, even now, that elements who, I'm trying not to get down into a head count or naming different outfits, but people who would prefer to have a united Ireland And then obviously you have unions, but they tend to sort of group it into a sectarian headcount. And I think that those days are sort of long gone, that because you were born of a particular religion, for some reason you wanted to stay on one side or the other. I think there's more logic to it, and that the people are more concerned about your economic power, you're able to grow up, jobs, opportunities. That comes into it's a bigger factor, cost of living, and which one would I be better off in, as opposed to a straightforward romantic notion of what they would like to see happen. I mean, I have two girls who went off to university in England, and normally that would have happened. They might never have come back during the height of the Troubles. Both of them have come back, and working around. That's great to see, and it's great for the future, irrespective of their background. It's great to see people come back. That's what I mean.
Would okay, so you joined the RUC kind of mid-80s. Would the main priority have been the IRA and investigating their crimes? Were like loyalists, were loyalist groups put as much of a priority? Or
well, they are. And if you look at the statistics about the number of loyalists caught, as in convicted, we'll go for the worst crime of murder. The statistically, more loyalists were imprisoned for terrorist offences and murder than there were Republicans. So that's always been the case, and it's quite a high statistic. I think there was less than 50% of Republican murders cleared, as police would talk about, as in somebody was got for them, than there were from the Loyalist side. But they were certainly pleased with impunity. I mean, Tennant Street had the Shankled butchers, as well as all the other murders. So I mean, it was a notorious area. But I mean, murder is death. I mean, when I think back at night in your quieter moments when something horrendous comes into your head, I mean, you don't have a definition of who it was or where it was, or you might remember for some specific incident, but it was just a murder. You went to it, and you did your best to find out who did it, irrespective of who the victim was.
I see. You mentioned earlier there that there would be times when like you're literally just trying to get to each murder scene and maybe collect a bit of evidence and do like the basic stuff, and then you're whisked off to another one. So with that in mind, like looking back, when you think back onto like investigations, do you think there was like corners cut, or kind of more rough methods used, given that you just simply don't have the time
The process would have been the same. It's not a case of corners were cut. You never got to the corner. Because there were 10 in the murder squad. There was a CID dealing with ordinary crime and murders as well, but there were 10 people in the murder squad in Tennant Street to cover that area, and I'm talking hundreds of murders, and they just physically couldn't, and they were already working every hour God sent, and many of them got burnt out as a result of it. And as I said, there wasn't a computer between them. And the murders were coming in thick and fast from both sides, and there was no quarter given. You just took as long as you could at the thing, and while you were looking at that murder, you were also investigating, like that man sent him investigating 64. Well, he's doing his best to try and find out if information came in about someone, and normally. I'll give you an example again. When the Yorkshire Ripper in England was on the go, there were 50 detectives assigned to try and track down a £5 note. 50. And there was 10 in the murder squad dealing literally with hundreds and hundreds of murders in one office. I mean, I can remember being in the murder squad office, and there was no wall. It was just covered in file boxes with names written on the end of them, and they were all unsolved murders. I mean, when I think back, it's absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's probably, I'd have to imagine they're generally tougher murders to investigate, because at least with a serial killer, there's kind of like clear motive and stuff. But in this murky world of like IRA and different groups and different intelligence agencies, there's a lot of things that kind of wouldn't seem that there wouldn't be as they seem. Someone might be an informant or a suspected informant, so the reason they're killed mightn't be so clear.
I mean, that could have happened, but that would have been internal housekeeping, as they describe it in the organizations. I mean, no informant ever was given immunity or impunity or whatever on either side in connection with a murder or anything beyond that. I mean, unfortunately, if you do want to get information from some people, there's no point going to the Women's Institute to get them. You've got to get down and dirty with the people who are involved. And sadly, sometimes it's having a beer with the devil. But no one certainly of any note or who committed a murder or anything like that would be a blind eye would be turned. I mean, if they were caught speeding or something like that, I'm quite sure there could have been something like that for them just to keep them happy, but it wouldn't have got much. Nothing serious would have been. Because it just wouldn't. It goes against every grain of a policeman anyway. To even be talking to them, never mind trying to help them.
Right. Did you do in your investigations or in carrying out your job? Did you ever clash with some kind of other government agency, be it like an intelligence agency, MI5, MI6, did FRU who ran Steak Knife, for example? Would you ever kind of bump into them and
there would have been no direct,
not ruin an operation, but like kind of crash into something that they had going that you didn't know about?
well, there wouldn't have been any direct involvement with policing an area and into people like that. And if it were to have ever happened, they would have sorted it out. I mean, ultimately, they were all working towards the same goal, albeit with different tactics. From some things are more secretive than others. And I mean, the state is obviously something that's in the media, and then with this recent death, alleged recent death, I should say, because we're not supposed to know if it's ever or not. But anyway, I mean, I don't know what he was done. I know from the Smithwick inquiry down south that he was supposedly, he and one of the guarded guys who was given information were all reporting back to Mark McGuinness. I read that, but I mean, how much of that's correct? There's a lot of myths springs up about these things too. So, but I certainly don't ever know of any problem. I mean, policing was difficult enough without complicating it with. Now there were different agencies, but eventually any intelligence gathering things the world over. I mean, that can happen in the States there between the FBI and local police or interstate police, or you just don't know. And it's not. And I mean, as John Hume famously said, there's no point in having a secret service if you don't keep it a secret.
Was it ever the case during your time in the RUC when anyone was caught, maybe caught like colluding with some paramilitary group? I know at least I think the RUC were accused of some kind of involvement or collusion with the Pat Finucane murder. But like anything like that, did you ever hear any rumblings?
I certainly never saw or heard of anything directly. And had I done, obviously I would have taken, like most policemen, the action, because our number one priority is to save life, irrespective of whose life it is. And I couldn't express that more thoroughly. Sometimes people will throw up the Glen End gang, who were sort of in the 70s, and was before my time, but it was rogue policemen when the murders were happening of all the policemen, and then try to act outside the law. That's a very pressed version. But whenever the investigated, but as I keep saying to anybody who listens, especially when they bring up the collusion thing, it's quite simple in my view that they wouldn't have heard of the Glen gang if the RUC hadn't gathered the information, investigated, realised it was them, brought them before a court and had them convict them, and they went to prison. So I mean, that's the only reason anybody knows about them. It was actually the RUC who did it, and yet we get accused of colluding with them, and it was us who put them in prison. It's a sort of an oxymoron the way that people would describe it, or even with when Pat Finucane's murder, there was talk that there was. I mean, I don't know because obviously I wasn't involved in it, but there was there was an informant. It may have been. It's been speculated, and sometimes speculation can very quickly become fact. Especially seeing as when often it's not something that can be very easily deniable, because if you start denying it, you're sort of confirming it or whatever. I don't know, but these things take on a life of their own. And then Mr. Finucane's own role, and his families within the IRA probably would have drawn so-called loyalists' attention to him in any case. He wouldn't have certainly needed help. They wouldn't have needed any guidance or pointers from the police to find him because of his own work with the IRA and his brothers being in it. In fact, they tried to extradite them from Dublin many time to get them charged up here.
Back in the 80s, I'd imagine not just with you, but kind of any police force. I'd imagine when it came to maybe things like interrogation and methods of force or being rough, it was probably a different game back then. Like back in the 80s, did you see like methods that you look back on and think were wrong or were too much?
And I never saw any of it in the I've heard, obviously, as you have, speculation in the press. We've just the death just recently of one of the so-called hooded men from the army back in 1971, I think it was, or two, I'm not sure. And there was white noise and things like that were more akin to, I suppose, Vietnam or somewhere. I don't know where. You would have heard about it. I've never known or spoken to, and I've spoken to a lot of cops over the years, both socially and at work, and over a sarsaparilla or two that perhaps they would have said things, but I've never heard anyone say or confirm anything like that. I mean, very often somebody who's being interviewed, if you're being interviewed for 7 days, you probably think it is torture. Or I suppose, technically speaking, you should. If they're trying to get you to confess to something you don't want to obviously say whether you did or didn't do. If you didn't do it, obviously you won't. But it's a very tricky one. I've never seen any proof of it. I've never seen any proof of the collusion. And if I had heard anything of it, and not just me, I know people who would have worked with, it wouldn't have been something that would have been acceptable. And that's why it certainly didn't exist on a scale that and bear in mind, we've had 40 years during the Troubles of propaganda against us, whereby these things, and they take on a life of their own, and things get distorted and become facts. I mean, even in nationalist areas after the ceasefire from the IRA, I mean, they started the parades problem about objecting to them, and then that all came about simply because the number of phone calls and people reporting things to the police had gone through the roof. It was starting to turn into a normal area, whereas before they'd managed to keep the security forces and the public sort of at each other's throats, which was a very important factor in any campaign. And indeed, I mean, it was quite a simple philosophy. If you shoot a British soldier walking down the street, well, the British soldier's going to take it out on local people when they stop using. They might be perhaps more ignorant, more aggressive, whatever it might be, with whoever they're speaking to. And then, you kill them. I mean, it's not hard to work out the cycle. But there's a difference between somebody being rude to somebody they've stopped, or and vice versa. I mean, it was a two-way encounter. Obviously, they didn't want to be stopped to umbrage with it, and they didn't want to be, I suppose, be there. Never mind stopping it. So it takes on a life of its own. But I've never seen any facts. I've never heard any evidence. And interestingly, and in this day and age, I just do not believe that it couldn't happen. If there was evidence, I mean, the RUC, even subsequently, I mean, must have been the most scrutinized force in the world. And I mean, I can't believe that nothing would have come forth in evidence. I mean, once you go beyond the conspiracy of one, you're in trouble. Because, when two people know about it, it's not a conspiracy anymore. Sooner or later, somebody's going to tell somebody. That didn't happen, obviously. Or there'd be people in court, as they should be if they did it.
I see. Would you say there was like a typical day that you would have as the type of RUC officer you were?
Well, I mean, if you're in uniform and on patrol, as it were, there was no sort of typical day, John, insofar as the typicalness of it was how untypical it would be. You could literally, and that's what I tried to do in the books, because when I had these stories gathered up, I was looking at it from a point of view of putting you or anyone who would read them in the front seat of a police car. So when the radio crackled into life, or you were sitting in an office and the phone went, you just literally, because that's what it was like, you didn't know, in the next 5 minutes whether you'd be laughing, crying, injured, dead. And that's what I was trying to convey. So when I had the stories, I had to think, well, how do you turn that into a book? And that's when I went for the timeline, from all around the station. And literally, it's the black humor that, it's not just Northern Ireland, it's the same with the guards, it's the same across the world. Black humor is infamous, and the policemen, a lot of police in the States I've met, in Canada, particularly through my brother, and it is exactly the same. Everywhere they have the same problems in common. There's just different labels attached to it, but they're the ones who have to run towards it and clear it up, and they build their own defense mechanism, which is very often some stupid joke will come out that's probably in poor taste, but it's not meant to be offensive. It's really to keep them sane.
Yeah, I've heard that. A previous guest that I spoke to was a gentleman who dealt with like chronic PTSD after being like a road cop. He'd seen like a lot of gruesome car crashes and shootings and all that sort of thing. And he was telling me that when he was on the job, he sort of had a kind of a happy mask that he would wear, and then he'd go home and he'd be boozing and feeling terrible, dealing with like post-traumatic stress. I'd have to imagine amongst officers in the RUC, some of the things they'd be seeing, like bodies blown apart and horrific things that no one should see. I'd have to imagine that dealing with that, dealing with that in your own time was a tough.
I remember bloody Friday in Belfast, policeman telling me that, he'd spent the day when the first bombs started to go off. People were coming, where will we go? The public, they looked to you automatically for, some words of wisdom that will help. And he said, we didn't even know what to tell them because there were so many bombs going off. We didn't know. We could have been sending them into the path of one. And there was one guy who worked in Belfast in the police, and he came around to the bus station to help. And he saw the remains of a torso sticking out from under a car. And he pulled it out to see if he could do anything to help. And back went on. The person was obviously that's everything missing and all the rest, and obviously dead. But they only found out later that was actually his brother, and he didn't recognize him. So how do you go home after that, and your wife's sitting there with the kids going, "What do you want for your tea?" And you'll never guess what Johnny did. He wouldn't do his homework or something. And you've got to live this sort of divide yourself in half and two bits of comfort. There's another fellow you're talking about accidents. They got a call. These are all these obviously from the books now, but they got a call on their way back. They were drifting back towards the station, thinking they finished at 11 or whatever it was. And a local car, they were a traffic car, said, "Oh, there's been an accident. The car was on fire. They didn't have a fire extinguisher." And the traffic cars were always well equipped with these things. And they said, "Oh, we have one." Anyway, they went over, long story short, when they got the thing was on fire. Fire brigade were trying to get the thing out, couldn't. But there was a person alive in the car, but they couldn't get near it with the heat. And this man was saying he was on his way home, literally 5 to 11 or something, drifting towards the station, thinking, "What'll I watch on TV when I get home to unwind for half an hour?" And he was at that thing for a while, and it took 20 minutes, he said, before the person actually died, and they couldn't get into the car. But he said, "I watched him burn to death." And he was actually standing with his hand on a gun, his own gun, thinking, if this doesn't, I might have to shoot this guy to put him out of his misery, like putting down a dog. So it's very hard to deal with that, and then arrive home and just automatically switch off or go to bed. And those are only two, I don't mean them necessarily aren't even that extreme, because it was such a common occurrence. When I spoke to one guy who was due to lay the wreath, funny enough, in a Skilling memorial, do you remember, in a Skilling bomb? And he was laying a wreath on behalf of the police at it, and it had been raining. And he told me that he's got chronic post-traumatic stress, but he didn't need to tell me. I knew by looking at him when he walked in the room to see me when I was doing this. And he went on to say anyway that it had been raining, and the inspector in charge said, "Look, lads, it stopped. You know, your sun shone." He said, "Take your coats off and go throw them back in the Land Rover because it looks smarter in the Chinook, and come back up and we'll get the service done." And they did that. And as we were walking back up, the bomb went off. And had he not, they had the inspector not said or it stopped raining, they would all have been dead. They'd have been standing right in front of it. And it was just one of those simple twists of fate. And then they spent their time trying to patch people up and pick up bits of bodies. And another girl was telling me the Oma bomb, her job was to match pieces of bodies with other pieces like a jigsaw. And she was 8 months pregnant at the time. And she said, "I always remember being pregnant and I'm trying to give birth. And I remember I had a spare foot with a striped sock. And she was trying to find the rest of the body for it. I mean, if you imagine doing that when you're 8 months pregnant and then supposed to, the day after carry it on then and go back and do some other sort of duty. So, and I don't mean to compress those. I mean, there's a lot of humor and stuff in the books, but there's still a reality of what it was like. And so, I mean, it was an impossible, with hindsight, particularly at the time. The irony is, John, that you went to whatever the call was, you did whatever it was and whatever you had to do, and John the next, and you sort of compartmentalize everything, even though it probably doesn't work. But in your head, you think it's working, and this isn't affecting you at all. And then it's only then sometime later that it hits you like a wet cloth in the face.
Was it common? It's kind of a common Irish solution in general to kind of drink away your feelings. But like, what was it common amongst officers to self-medicate when they're all?
100%. I think that's applicable across the world as well with cops. I remember one guy telling me when he joined the police he didn't drink, and he ended up in the crime squad, and they dealt solely with serious incidents and they were traveling all around the province because local CID wouldn't have had the manpower. So 10 of them would go down or whatever it might be, and there was 10 hotels, so they're working hard all day, just that the thing. And the way he put it to me was, he says, "Well, I didn't drink when I first joined." He says, "But then your drink became your medicine." And then he looked at me and he says, "And by God, we took some medicine." And I knew exactly what he meant. And that was just what was part of it. And some of them ended up with difficulty. Some can handle it better than others. And a lot of them I know couldn't and paid the price. And also, I mean, apart from the 302 murdered, there was over 10,000 injured, many of them with life-changing operations, and another 90 committed suicide from what they'd seen. Well, we all decided to join, and we all enjoyed it. It was part and parcel of it. But if that 302, just for your own audience, if that was converted, allowing for the population, in America, that would be 66,000 policemen dead. And then it sort of brings the figure home more because you can get a few hundred, people get very blasé about it. But I mean, if all of a sudden you've got the Dodgers stadium full, dead bodies, it's a harsher story, and I don't even know what the 10,000 injured would convert to.
Right. Would it be common for like burnout to occur with officers? To get stressed to the point where they have some kind of breakdown, or they're incapable of functioning normally or doing their job properly?
Well, it did happen, and I'm sure it still does. I mean, it's not just even sort of tied to the RUC. It was probably just tied to because of what they were dealing with. But yeah, there's no doubt people who are married, young kids, and what have you, or even there's family life brings its own stresses, and then sometimes trying to flick a switch, at 5 o'clock, when you're not a policeman anymore, now you're a husband. Would you help, so and so with his homework? Would you do the grass needs cut? Would you put the bin out? And all these mundane things. And I don't mean to belittle them because it's life, but it's very difficult. And some people have obviously more difficulties than others to switch. And then what you were doing at work, I mean, what I'm saying, and I mean literally shoveling bodies up into a plastic bag, and that, how do you go from that to, I mean, most people, if you're working in an office, you might have a chat with your wife, partner, whatever, but how your day was. But I mean, that's not really a topic for over tea with the kids, so they tended to bottle it up. And, how's your day? I was fine, or else they'd go for a drink after work. And going for a drink after work, for the simple reason, cops understood. You didn't need to explain to them what it was like. So the tendency was they would group and talk to each other, and then you hear those things with cop talk and all the rest of it. And I understand fully how that would happen, because you didn't want to bring it up at home, and you couldn't, and you'd be the worst in the world for doing it, and yet you were becoming the worst in the world because you're coming home half cut with a drink, and that was leading to a different problem because you couldn't talk about it, and then the vicious cycle just goes on. I remember a guy telling me that they were in West Belfast, and there was a lorry hijacked and put across Glory, and it was coming up at 3 o'clock, and of course they wanted to go home. Rather than waiting to call the army out by the time they fiddle and muck about, as they would put it. Obviously, they're trying to defuse a bomb, and you don't want to rush it. But anyway, they're going, by the time they fiddle about, we'll be here to all hours, and they just wanted to get away. So it was coming up, it was 2:45 to 3, and one of the guys with him used to be a lorry driver before he joined, and he said to the sergeant, and this is true verbatim, it's one of the books, but he said, he says, Sarge, I can drive that. I can move it. We've had a look at it. It doesn't seem to have a bomb in it. I can move it and clear the road, and the world will go back to normal. And he said to him, the sergeant looked at him and he said, you'll do that once too often. And that was the day. You'll do that once too often. And that was the day. It was too often. He was a big guy. When he got in and sat in the car, there was a bomb set to detonate with a weight on the seat. Rather than under they looked under the car or under the lorry to see if there was anything attached to it that would go off and get started or moved or whatever, a mercury tilt switch or something. But it was actually under the seat, and of course nobody looked there. He went down, set up, was blown up. And the fellow who was telling me the story was his best mate. And he said he got into the back of the ambulance, the injured guy, and he just sat up and he sort of saluted and waved. And he said that was him saying goodbye, and he just fell down dead.
I was going to say, how would you possibly go home and tell
how your day was?
Anyway.
And funny enough, he told me when he did go home, he was going up the driveway to the house, and then he said, no, I have to get out of here. And he didn't go in, and he went to see an uncle of his who'd been in the place. He says, I knew he'd understand. And he went and talked to him.
Yeah, I've interviewed like military people in the past, and they said the same thing, that like even if they could sit and describe for hours the things they saw and felt and smelled and stuff, you just couldn't to a civilian, because they just don't have the context at all. I can very much understand how they'd end up just socializing with each other outside of it, because they're the only people who could understand kind of how they felt,
Yeah, and that's what happens, and I say that leads then to its own difficulties as well. I mean, there's another guy told me he was in a helicopter, and they fired a rocket at it, and it blew the tail thing off, stabilizing the propeller. Anyway, and it starts to fall. It's supposed to fall like an old sycamore leaf, twiddle around as it comes to the ground, and it's a controlled landing. I actually remember sitting, in fact, I was sitting here when I was writing, woke up, and I won't use the exact word he used, but he just said a controlled descent, they call it, hitting the ground at a certain rate, I'd call it. And he said the thing came down like a stone. But anyway, he got out and he survived, which was the important thing. And he said, and I was just so elated. And then it turned out he was walking back to the station, and he was standing sort of taking in what had happened, the helicopter crashing, the rocket hitting it, everything that had gone on. And where he was standing, he only found that there was a secondary bomb in the hedge where he was standing looking back at it. But it failed to detonate. And he said, I got into the house, and I phoned my girlfriend. He said, I phoned my wife. Nobody was in. I had to tell somebody something. He said, and I was ringing all around. And he actually said, obviously, Colin Breen, I get CB. And I said, CB, I'm not joking. He said, I'd have phoned the speaking clock and told it if I could have got the number. He said, I just had to talk to somebody about it all. And he was laughing at himself. But he couldn't, there was nobody there. He says, the one day I rang everybody I knew, couldn't get hold of a single person.
That's an interesting thing you brought up about having the need to voice it and express in words how you feel. It's certainly a thing amongst more so amongst men that men tend not to talk about their feelings, their battles, and all that. I'd have to imagine back then it would be more so, and especially in a job that required like a stiff upper lip, and a tough kind of more.
It had that sort of macho feel about it, that you were seen as, you weren't seen as weak, but in your head you thought you were showing weakness if you did get upset or anything like that. So even if you were upset, you went off somewhere on your own to be upset. You wouldn't have done it in front of your mates, or if you're out for a drink, you had to be the tough guy with them, and they were all probably having the same facade of keeping it, and then they just drink more. And so it went on in a vicious cycle, and it's the world over. I mean, it's not peculiar to Northern Ireland or the violence. I mean, I'm sure there's cops not too far away from you who do the exact thing. Hence, in the States, you'd have what are known as police bars, because that's where they tend to go. And you always think, oh, that place is full of cops, and they're in there sounding off.
I read during doing a bit of research for this that at one stage you showed up to a scene that was to be your murder scene. Is that right?
Alarmingly, yes. And I'm also I used not to actually, I know I put it in the book, but I used to not say a lot about it for the simple reason, John. I was very conscious that somebody died who, well, I don't mean in my stead, but certainly when I went down, I was out in a van driving about, and the police who'd been at the scene of the murder couldn't identify the person, and but they'd been claimed by the IRA as a policeman, and none of the police knew them. There no ID on them, and it was unusual. They just couldn't do it. And anyway, that was all fine and dandy, insofar as it is. I was out and about, and I went down and looked, and I can remember putting the sheet back and says face now, actually, when I'm talking to, and I go, no, I don't know, and sort of moved on with my day, and that was the way you had to do it when you. Anyway, and it was a pressed version of it, but I went back then to my office, and I was in there, and a friend of mine rang me. He used to play rugby with, and from a special branch, and he said to me, CB, did you see that shooting today? And I said, did I see it? I was actually down at it. And he said, did you see his car? And I said, no. And he wasn't in the car. I mean, so anyway, the upshot of it was the difference. I didn't identify too much with him. I can't remember what I wrote in the book. But anyway, the difference in the targeting of him, who was nothing to do with the police. He wasn't in the police. He was actually going to local tech on day release from his work. But he lived near where I worked. And the difference was in it between a 3 and an 8 in the targeting. One of the cars was 3, and the other one was 8. And the same type of car and color. And obviously the IRA people who were watching said, it's a 3 and 8, they've got the number wrong, because it was too coincidental for it to be, that was the only difference. And the number itself was, every other digit was correct, except that 3 and 1 8. So they started to follow the wrong car.
Jesus Christ. Did you remember exactly how you felt when the penny dropped that it was?
Well, because at the time when I was there, I didn't realize, and it was only when my friend rang me. And if he hadn't known me in my car, I might never have heard. But anyway, I had to get a new number plate from security branch that afternoon. The car, I had to get rid of it the next day. And just, that was another few changes and things being, security wise, for my own security. But yeah, it was I think I'm a member of a fairly unique club that I've actually attended my own murder.
Yeah, that's true. What I was going to say to you, okay, so would it be presumed that if a particular RUC officer was being targeted like you, would it be possible that they were just targeted because they were an RUC officer, or would it have to be like an officer of particular annoyance to whoever?
I mean, there may be occasions when some person has, had the maybe leading an investigation into something and they've had particular success against a particular group from whatever quarter, and they might have taken thick, as we would say at home, against him personally. But for the most part, and it would tend to be, the provos or something that were killing policemen. It was just you were just a policeman. It didn't really matter. It would. I'm not saying it never happened, but it wouldn't have always been, that particular person. It would have. They just were a cop and you were handy, and they could. Were an easier target than some other guys, or you can make yourself a more difficult target by taking measures. Not everybody did, and not everybody stuck to them, and it paid the price again. But that's just how it worked. Somebody's going to tell you there in my head. Anyway.
What would be some of the methods, I don't know if you call them like counter surveillance or preventing yourself from getting followed, but can you remember any just out of interest?
Well, you would certainly have quite a high vigilance, as in a level of people. If you saw cars or people, too often, beyond the coincidence of seeing them, you would have heightened awareness. Or motorbikes would have been a danger coming up behind you, and there's a pillion passenger, you'd be certainly keeping a close eye, let's say. And the closer you got, I mean, you can vary your route all you want, but sooner or later you have to get to where it is you work. So, I mean, obviously the route's narrow, the closer you get to it, and that's, you could almost work out where the areas are to where you're most exposed to the attack, and then you would take whatever measures. But checking under your car, certainly, for booby trap bombs would be a must. And very often, if they're watching, which they will have been, and they see you do that, and he always checks his car, and we'll go on to find somebody else who's maybe more lackadaisical about it or doesn't bother all the time. And that's just, again, the reality of these things. And many's the person has fallen foul of it for that reason.
Right.
You've always got to try it. I mean, and you'll never do. I mean, there's no such thing as absolute security, but you can make it look, even if it's not, you make it look as difficult as possible for the terrorist, or there's a chance that he might get caught, or that you're vigilant, or you're always armed or carried. I remember one guy down the country always went out to his car in the mornings when he was heading to work carrying a shotgun. And they would think, oh, I'm not going near him. Especially a shotgun, because it's hard to miss him. So, but it's amazing how that works. And there had been cases when they had been looking at him and they were put off by his vigilance. So, I mean, it can be done. And because I remember actually with the rioting there a while ago in the States, and I remember reading about some police officer, I think they were in New Jersey, but getting attacked at home. And I was just thinking to myself, now, it's one thing getting shot at work when you're just the uniform walking about, but if they went to their house because of them, that's up 10 gears. And that's where I was actually thinking to myself, I mean, for America, that is the most dangerous thing out of all of this street disorder and deaths and all that have been happening. That's the one thing that's the most dangerous that I've, in my opinion, that of what I'd heard or set off the biggest alarm bell with me. Because once that starts happening, or if you found that police in particular areas would decide not to go to work because it was too dangerous, if they were leaving their families and houses exposed at home, and they don't go. I mean, that's a proper problem, or going to become one.
I agree. No, I agree. Was there ever occasions where, I suppose, I mean, the Belfast area is relatively small, compared to other places.
Yeah.
Did you ever Did you ever, when you were off the job, did you ever run into someone you had arrested or questioned or dealt with while in a professional capacity, but you run into them on the street?
When you're off duty. Yeah, it's happened now and again, and you get this bizarre area whereby, say, I'm going to say a pub just for the pick somewhere that you could be in having a pint with friends or whatever, and somebody comes in, and you can see you recognise them, and most cops would be fairly observant anyway, and would particularly, I mean, my kids used to keep me going, but I had to sit, as I called the gunslinger seat, in a restaurant. I wanted to sit facing the door, all that sort of carry on. And they would actually used to try to run ahead. It was the funniest thing on earth. We'll get to the seat facing the door because Dad will want it. He'd annoy him and he'd throw us out of it, which he did. Anyway, I mean, they'd even noticed. So you would have that, and you can actually find yourself in a place with, two players, as it were, and but you're probably both pretending that nobody knows who the other one is. Yeah, everybody knows full well. I've even been in a bar. In fact, you just reminded me, like on the outskirts of Belfast with someone, and two players, and very evil, bad players, multiple murderers. And I was standing the next thing, 2 pints came over. And I go, that's because I didn't even live anywhere near where I was. And I go, what's this 2 pints? And there's a gentleman over there. And I went over in their chairs. And that was them just saying, we know you and we know who you are and all the rest. And sent me over 2 pints, which I finished and left. As they say in the best newspapers, I made my excuses and left. But I mean, that didn't happen to me very often, but it did happen that one day. I remember that one afternoon, and it was it wasn't a place you'd have expected to be. Also, it wasn't anywhere near anywhere that anybody should know me. But I suppose everybody has to be somewhere.
Right. I remember reading that book. Remember that book, Say Nothing, by Patrick Radden Keefe?
Yes, I know the book you mean. I haven't read it actually, but I do know it.
It's quite, yeah, it's very good if anyone hasn't. But there was one story where don't quote me on the details now, but I think it was an intelligence officer, and he'd been interrogating like a suspected or what was real, what was a real Republican, and let him go, and then went for dinner some night in a seafood place, and it was your man who served him his meal. Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's not just it doesn't help for a relaxing evening when you're trying to throw the food down your neck as quickly as possible and get out, because the whole danger is obviously going to be that whilst he might be there and he's at his work, and yeah, they make a phone call and they're waiting on the outside, as soon as and they'll probably know your car if they're that you feel that known, or even if they don't know your car, they're going to know you coming out, and they'll describe what you're wearing and whoever you're with. So that would be the problem.
Would you mind telling me a bit about you mentioned there was 5 occasions where you were shot at, 3 Republican, 2 Loyalists. Were they shootouts or how
No, they weren't anything as dramatic. I'm happy to report. They were more just in the area that the terrorists would open fire at place for whatever reason, and I happened to be with others. There wasn't that specifically at me. It was just a shooting at us because we were there. And I mean, that was coming off. I mean, the first, just when you were saying actually about different organizations, the first policeman murdered in the Troubles, Victor Arbuckle, was shot dead by Loyalists on the Shankill Road in Agnes Street. Back in 1969 or something. I can't remember. I should know, it's terrible. But anyway, he was standing at the corner just outside a bank with a couple other cops, and opened fire on them, and he was killed.
Did you ever this is something I'd struggle with like a small bit myself. Like I certainly agree with the goal of wanting a united Ireland and 32 counties. I can very much see and I agree with the argument for that, but I wouldn't ever think that targeting civilians or bombs or acts of what I would call acts of terrorism, I don't think that's justified in in its pursuit. Did you ever have like a degree of kind of empathy or sympathy with the goal of some of the IRA men? Not the methods, of course, but the actual.
I can understand the intellectual argument as to how they would want it. Obviously, I draw a line with them trying to kill me over it, because call me old-fashioned. But so from that aspect, but there again, I was saying to you that I was due to go to Trinity. I mean, I went to boarding school in Dublin, so I've known the South fairly well, and I mean, I don't know how much time we spent. It's not like a competition. I go down to all the rugby matches, played rugby down there, played for clubs there and against clubs there. So, I mean, that's not like I saw the South as some alien country that I would never want anything to do with. Politically, I would never have aspired, but equally too, I wasn't probably chronically against it. And if anything, it's been because, and then I suppose but even setting aside the police, I would think that I mean, politically and just what I was saying about financially and economically and opportunity and all that, I don't have that desire, but it's not that it's a blind objection to it. It's merely that as well as a bit grand to say intellectually, I wouldn't necessarily agree with it or aspire to it, but I understand how people do aspire to it, and I couldn't care less about that. And when I say I don't mean, I'm not dismissing your aspiration. What I mean is I have no objection to anybody having that aspiration. So perfectly, why wouldn't you? And why shouldn't you? Or anybody have it? Where I drew the line was probably I'm even more strongly stubborn about it now, rather than any chance of being more open to it, is probably because of the violence. And that would sort of makes it a cold home for me, a place that I spent my formative years at school. And that's sad too. But it's because of what people want to do in the name of it, rather than, and that's not the people down there that I know who want that. It's a minority, and it's always minorities everywhere, including on the Loyalist side here, who create the problem. As I've always said, in Northern Ireland, Catholics and Protestants, and especially in working class areas, had more problems in common than they had that caused them to fight each other. And if they'd only realised that, these troubles might never have started.
Yeah, I agree with you. Far more in common than different. Yeah, the sectarian aspect is like Catholic people, so some Catholic people hating Protestants and vice versa. It's a real shame. Yeah, there's really no fundamental like difference.
Well, we used to say we've got too much religion and not enough Christianity. That's a fundamental part of our difficulty, and it's them and us, and I mean it's a nonsense when living 50 feet apart, and until probably we get kids being educated in school together, they'll still continue in places that grow up as if the people who go somewhere else on a Sunday, if they even go these days, are aliens, and it's just not the case. And I mean, I don't know. All I see I never see crowds rushing out of churches around here anyway. And yet it seems to be so important that we'll kill each other over it, but not important enough to waste your hangover on a Sunday morning sitting there listening to bad music.
Yeah, I understand. I wanted to ask you there. Obviously, you've been out of the game, yeah, so to speak, like any any dealings with Republicans or IRA or anything. But just from your point of view, now and in the last kind of 10-15 years, what would you say the role of the IRA is in the North? Like, it's not obviously that there's not thankfully that there's not really shootings and bombings, so on. My perception in the Republic anyway, I know that they're known for like shaking down drug dealers for collecting like a tax on drug dealers. But to my knowledge, I wouldn't really know, but to my knowledge, like no, we'll say operations, like so to speak. Would that be the same up the north? They're just kind of involved in
they're probably very similar on both sides of the border. But I know police obviously on both sides of it are still doing people in Interpol. In fact, they left the guards. really what we were left with peace, inverted commas, were our crime gangs. I mean, they still need a certain amount of money to run their operations. They haven't gone away, as famously was said. They do target drug dealers, both lots of paramilitary. I don't just mean the IRA, but then they don't target IRA or drug dealers who are sanctioned and who are paying them. And that applies equally to both sides and moving drugs around Europe. If you can get a ton of Semtex in, you can get a ton of hash in, or a ton of cocaine, and there's an awful lot of money in that, but there's not much money in Semtex. And they still got to make a living, and it was what disclosed in the Cash for Ashes here. Funny enough, a little snippet that came out during the inquiry was that the Sinn Féin ministers were still, emails turned up in his email thing when they were investigating the inquiry, that still coming from the IRA Army Council saying, yes, that's okay to go ahead with that, to the finance minister here. And I mean, I'm not saying I wouldn't say it, because if legal aid was stood over, I mean, that happened. So it was still they were still running past the IRA and the Army Council, the third tier of command the day-to-day, but they were still running stuff past it before the sanction it went into law here. So, I mean, you work it out. I don't know how influential they are, but I know that there's a lot of money at stake on both sides, and that's what we've been left with. And then, of course, if they make themselves enough use, and some government will throw money at them to make them stop doing something. And that's, again, the world over happens.
Very good. I'll leave you go soon enough there. We mentioned it. We mentioned it a couple of times, but the books you wrote, I'm looking forward to getting into them myself. But I think the description you gave was like you wanted to tell like the real life human stories of these people who work such a difficult job in such a difficult time, you know.
That's correct. And what I was trying to do, history was being rewritten, as happens the world over. And it was really, I just felt that, and policemen were always very reluctant to speak about their experiences, the type of things we were talking about today. They were very reluctant to speak about them. And when I did the first book, it was just called A Force Like No Other, simply because of the peculiar circumstances, not any special thing about the force itself. But and then as the popularity of the books, and then people started to realize that actually, do you know what, you can tell about things that happened and things they experienced and the world didn't fall in. So anyway, so then we got the first like no other the next shift, because I'm very imaginative with my titles. We got one. And then the third one was the force like no other, the last shift, as it went to the wind out. And the second book touched on post-traumatic stress, as well as incidents like the Ballygully bus bombing. I remember the fellow telling me he had a torch, no lights, crawling around, feeling how much of the body was there, and he was saturated in blood all over the floor of it. I couldn't see, and apart from the story, he said in many ways the torch made it worse, because you'd flashing and see these bits of body, and he describes going up one, and he got the shoulder, and he said, "Oh, I wonder, is this guy alive? That most of the body's here," and then they got up to the top, there's no head. And he was crawling around in blood, literally saturated. And he said it wasn't until he got home then the tears came for him, but he had to deal with it at the time. So things like that. Was that a reason for saying, it was the post-traumatic stress. I touched on it in the second book, and there's some harrowing stories I'm not going to try and tell you now. But and then the third one, I wanted to let families speak, because I mean it was all very well for us at work, because when we were at work we knew we were all right. And if you weren't all right, well, you might not have known, but nobody, it didn't matter. But the families were at home just watching the clock, and maybe hearing the news, and there'd been an incident, or whatever, and they don't know whether you're alive or dead. And there's actually a woman who talked about dreading a knock on the door, and the police coming down. Her uncle or somebody was a senior policeman, but and her husband had been shot, and it turned out he wasn't dead. But I mean, it was that drive, and she didn't know, no mobile phones, no nothing, until they got there. They ended up going to Canada, and the guy met the person who shot him in Canada, and actually became friends. I mean, it's an incredible story. But there's others, you know, just mundane policing stories, going to a burglary at a school, and the guy's partner getting killed. Or said her father never came home. He's a different person. Then there was problems at home because of the mental problems he was having. They're just, I was trying to humanize the uniform. And you know, people here, you know, it should it be in the States as well or anywhere? You know, two cops were killed. There's just two uniforms. I don't know. There was another one in Friendly Street of all places in Belfast. These two policemen went around the corner. They were driving past, and one of them came back with his best friend, oh, sticking to his flak jacket. He was blowing all over him, all his insides, everything. You know, and that's from they were, I think they'd been over getting pepper or something. They were coming back, and there was a call that somebody needed help, and that's what they were going to do. And then they detonated a bomb. So I mean, I don't mean that book's full of that, but it's the harsh reality. There's no polite way to blow someone up, you know. And this is what terrorists from wherever they're from, and from whatever side they're from, it's the same net result. They deal in death. They keep undertakers wealthy, glaziers wealthy, blowing places. And sooner or later, somebody has to go along and try and tidy up after it. And more importantly, stop them. Because we just can't do it when kids are left. And it's their future. It's not mine. I've had my time at it's the kids.
It sounds to me like the contents of your books would make for a good I don't know, film or TV series. I mean, there's a lot more TV series these days with the likes of Netflix and Hulu's and them. Did you have any kind of I don't know, any wishes to
Well,
see?
I did do I don't know what to call it. It was a Imagine Belfast Festival up near Queen's University there around Easter, and I had an actor and an actress reading stories from some of the books. And Mark Davenport from the BBC was talking to me and asked me questions and leading in, and that actually it sold out in 2 days. So there was an appetite to hear it. And so I have since been speaking to someone, of course, getting finance is a problem for anything, but would like to see some sort of stage production of bringing the stories, not just they're being told, but they're being brought to life. And again, sort of putting life into the horrors of what they're breathing life into where the horrors took life. As to how things came about and the after effect and the effect that it's had on the families. But I mean, the books are called A Force Like No Other, all three, and they're on Amazon in America. I'm going to plug in now. And probably the bookshops should be able to get them as well. But anyway, but they've certainly been very popular because they've shown, it's just the reality. There's nothing dressed up. They didn't need dressed up. And the one thing I would say about them is, irrespective of my background or anything else, there's no opinion given by any one of the people who spoke to me, and there's no commentary. It's just what happened when they got the call or they went to wherever. And there's an awful lot of humor in them. There's an awful lot of horror in them. And there's the families and the post-traumatic stress. And anybody's, I mean, you don't have to have been a policeman to realize the value of the document from the historical point of view, I think. But I would do, I suppose. But they're an interesting read, and people who have told me that, I mean, the comments I get back, and I get people who have I'm on Twitter, Colin Breen 12, and that, and people send me messages on that, or I have a web page, just colinbreen.com, I think. I've never actually looked myself up. I think it's colinbreen.com. But anyway, so people send me messages through that as well when they've read the books, and it's been very moving for me in that people thanking me for being their voice, which I wasn't trying to be. I was trying to just put the stuff on record for history, but the fact that they felt nobody was taken, you know, families particularly of people who were injured or killed in the Troubles, not just police, but that somebody's taken an interest in what happened and is telling the story of what happened to their father, grandfather, mother, or what they witnessed. There's harrowing stories of all sorts of things, and I could be here this time next week, trying to tell you them. But anyway, force like no other. If anybody's of an interest, it's there, and see what they think. And then hopefully I'm always very loath to say they enjoy it. I always say to people, I hope you find this of interest. I'm not sure enjoy is the right word, but anyway.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. You can be something can be very fascinating and insightful and interesting, but about a topic that isn't quite what you would call enjoy. But yeah, I know.
And you will laugh. I mean, and people try. In fact, a very I better not name him because I'll never hear the end of it. But he's a national news BBC journalist, and who's retired now. But anyway, he was back visiting Northern Ireland. Contacted me and met him for a couple of biffs, and he actually said to me that I knew he'd read the books because he corresponds with me now and again. But he said to me, he says, he says that last book of yours, he said, you made me weep. He always said weep. That's what makes me remember it. But he said, you've made me weep. And I said, well, that's not bad for a cynical old hack like you of 30 odd years reporting from all around the world. And I said, I'll take that. Actually, I was writing them up, of course. Well, that's good. I've always wanted to make you. But anyway, we had a laugh about it, which tells its own tale. But he was being very serious about how moving he found the stories. And he had reported from here at times for the national news in London.
Very good. I'll leave you go. Thank you very much. So much.
No, thank you. Thoroughly enjoyable. And hopefully we'll team up sometime and get a beer in real life.
Well, absolutely, yeah. If you're ever over New York, I despite living in Ireland, my whole growing up life, I've never been up north, so I'd love to go sometime.
Well, it's time you did. I can organise I was going to say a tour, maybe give you tours. Anyway, I can show you around the place. Don't worry about that. Just contact me anytime. Anyway, good to talk to you, John, and a pleasure to meet you, albeit through the atmosphere.
Soundbite. Thanks again for the insight, everything you shared. I'll put a link in the podcast and the YouTube to the books, so people can get them if they like.
Well, that would be fantastic. And if you can drop me a line to let me know when you've got it, or I'll get hold of it somewhere.
Fantastic.
Okay. I hope that was all right for you anyway.
Thanks very much, Colin.
All right. Cheers. Take care of yourself.